Thank you for joining us today. I'm Natalie Sims of the Nevada Cannabis Association, and I wanted to welcome you to today's webinar, Cannabis Business Services, Consumption Lounge Exposures, and Risk Transfer. Today we have Jim McErling of National Cannabis Managing Agency and Wholesale Broker, Cannasure. Also joining us today are commercial insurance broker Matt Engel and special counsel Jody Green of Miller Nash. Jim, Matt, and Jody will review insurance options and significant factors as they relate to consumption lounges, including the current status of regulations, exposures to be aware of, risk mitigation, and insurance products to help. So with that, we'll be starting with an overview of the current status of regulations and the next steps in Nevada. And I will turn over the floor to Matt Engel. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Nevada Cannabis Association. And for all those out there attending here virtually, appreciate the interest in the topic. There was a fair amount of interest in this, and we're happy to be here and have a discussion. We plan on this being roughly 30 minutes. So yeah, if you have questions, put them in there. We'll get to them as much as we can. And with that, you know, our agenda for the day is really just a few topics. As Natalie mentioned, we kind of hit these already, and we'll just go right to the current status. So as some of you may know, if you're on this call right now, the regulations are still not fully complete. The Cannabis Compliance Board, otherwise known as the CCB here in Nevada, has had 2 public workshops already on this, where they've been taking comments and input from the public, stakeholders, and other interested parties. And this is a good thing for the industry. Getting the input, I think, is allowing people to weigh in with their opinions and thoughts and ideas on what will work here for us here in Nevada. And there is going to be a third one that is yet to be scheduled. So I would imagine that will be in the near future. To stay in touch with that, I would advise to stay in touch with the Nevada Cannabis Association, specifically Lake. She's really into this thing hot and heavy. Lake was supposed to be with us here this morning to provide some of the updates on this particular slide, but she was called into a county commission meeting. So that's the reason she's not with us, but I would imagine many on this call will know who she is, and feel free to stay in touch with her. The other things on this slide really are just kind of this will be a takeaway, call it. There's some links here if you do want to know what the latest regulations are, what are the proposed changes, and what is the status of the application. From what the noise on the street is, the application process may open up by this summer for those operations that are looking to apply and be granted a license to have a consumption lounge. And with any luck, we may start seeing some cannabis lounges opened up by the end of this year. But there's still some work to do, as the regulations are still not complete, and we have to have those before anything can be opened up. So what is the insurance industry doing? What should operators be looking at now in preparation? Well, as far as the insurance industry goes, overall, the insurance industry normally is a little slow to respond, kind of one of the last moving parts of an emerging industry, because they like to see data. They like to see what's happened. Well, we don't have that at this point. So what is the industry doing? They're modeling, and a lot of the states are doing this now. They're modeling consumption lounges with the bars and taverns and nightclubs that are out there, and different dram shop laws. Nevada, we don't have that. We'll talk about that here shortly. But that's the closest thing that the insurance industry is benchmarking against and modeling after as they start to prepare for this. So what can you do as a potential operator in this space? Well, this is where we start talking about training not only for the operators, training of the staff. And these are all important features to look at as you look at opening, and also how am I going to ensure my potential operation here? If something happens to me and I get sued, do I have insurance for it? And how can I help myself be an attractive person or operation to get insurance for my operation? These are some things that are there. These are things that will help you not only prevent potential claims and losses and issues at your facility, but also allow you the opportunity to get insurance at a competitive rate. So some of these things I've got on here, and I'll get some input from Jody and Jim on this as well. Security. How secure is my facility? Do I have the proper surveillance in there? Are my security guards trained? Do I outsource that? Have they been properly trained? Age verification. Those of you in the dispensary world today know that this has been a hot topic. How are we verifying that these people are 21 years old and older? And who is liable in the event that an underage person does come in there? Customer education. What are the warnings? What type of warnings are we putting in our facilities? Are we educating our patrons on the dangers of overconsumption? Items like that. I would have plans and processes in place for that, documented. And then not only is that going to help you with your licensing and help you preventing, losses and claim issues, it will help you when you go and look for insurance products out there to help you with your operation. So those are a few bullet points. Jody, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add in this area.
Maybe just to step back and chime in that, for any operator, really not limited to consumption lounges in particular, but especially for those operating in the cannabis industry, it's so important to start with compliance and risk management on the front end when creating your business plan, right? And so starting with preparing all of those SOPs and, like Matt said, training on all of the various issues, because operators are subject to all of the same legal and compliance requirements as other companies. So HIPAA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, wage and hour issues, like all of those very important and sort of, I guess some might view as basic compliance issues, can result in a claim if they're breached. And we've seen lots of lawsuits against various types of cannabis operators for things that are easily overlooked, like the height of a counter that might violate the Americans with Disabilities Act, the types of entry to the establishment, again, for ADA compliance, things like text messaging of marketing advertisements that might breach things like the TCPA, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. So all of that stuff on the front end, just making sure the ducks are in a row on risk management overall is very important. And I think I agree entirely with Matt in terms of, viewing this from the standpoint of, alcoholic consumption. That's really the benchmark that we have and look at in terms of evaluating exposure for the cannabis industry. And maybe Jim has some thoughts from the carrier side too.
Well, and let's take that now a step forward or two. So everyone's going to be pursuing their license for their consumption lounge. And the excitement is, of course, the launch of a new business entity, a new establishment, new operation. And that's always going to come with a little bit of potential extra loss just because these are all new. But fast forward a year or two, and what does happen if, in fact, there were some initial claims? The insurance industry is always, as Matt said, kind of reactionary. So we're going to look at your account in a year or two or three and say, wow, these things happened in 2022, 2023. Now that we're in 2024, what are you doing to resolve the past? So we always take a look backwards at what steps are you implementing today to resolve what happened yesterday. So it's important that we do have a great foundation on your behalf on what are you doing to make your current workplace and your business safe for the general public as well as for your employees. And then going forward, you'll have a better story to tell the insurance industry, because at the end of the day, you're trying to find the best coverage at the best price, and claims activities gets in the way. Claims activity is going to slow down the best coverage at the best price. So you want to see what you can do today to keep your costs of insurance affordable and reasonable in the future.
Yeah,
Well,
that's a great point, Jim.
Yeah, well put. I don't think I've had many clients that ever think that they're paying too little for their insurance. Everyone thinks they pay too much for it. So anything we can do to help on those areas are typically related to, one, no claims, but also having the right policies, procedures, training of staff, and all those procedures in place to show your insurance broker. So that it's critical. So
yeah, let me also just point out, I think, something that Jim raised made me think of this, right? Like, it's so important for for operators to be working with their broker on the application. And, there's often many questions during the underwriting process relating to risk mitigation and procedures and policies and procedures in place to avoid loss, right? And so hopefully, the insurance industry, carriers like Jim will be working with brokers and the companies operating in the space to make sure that they have all of the, the most robust risk management and risk prevention in place to prevent the loss and prevent the rise in costs, potentially that would come along with the claim. Because we're not really reinventing the wheel here. Yes, in some respects, consumption lounges for cannabis are new. But I think that, we all have a fairly decent idea of what needs to go into the risk management package for a company. And it definitely starts with training and proper procedures.
So here's our refresher on insurance coverages, and many of you who have purchased insurance in the past probably recognize all of these terms, and they're not uncommon. It's just a matter of are we getting the right coverage without the exclusions on these particular coverage forms for your operation, and again the care, and there are programs now that are providing this coverage today. There's not a bunch of cannabis consumption lounges across the country. There are carriers, and Jim will speak to that later, that on a landscape of the insurance marketplace now on who what's out there and how many are actually providing it. But there are certainly a handful of carriers that do provide this coverage today, and many are kind of still in wait mode. So at any rate, what types of coverages? General liability. We all hear about the slip and fall and the bodily injury issues. Somebody slipped and smashed their face, and now there's an issue. We've got medical problems. We've got potential litigation from establishments getting sued. So general liability helps in those areas. Assault and battery is put down there because that is, and personally, I've been insuring cannabis operations for close to a decade, all up and down the supply channel, including the services that help them, security guards and testing labs and all the production and everything. So I have had assault and battery claims in dispensaries. It does happen. And it is an area you're really going to want to look at on these consumption lounges, because my speculation, it's not, if, it'll be more of a when. These things just tend to happen. So make sure your insurance policy has that coverage on it. Cannasure has a buyback option there.
Yeah, I'll also chime in on that issue, because certainly assault and battery and also theft, we've seen quite a rash of robberies and really horrible things happening in various states, maybe not so much in Nevada, but and fingers crossed, right? Like it stays that way. But oftentimes GL policies will exclude coverage for claims involving security services that are hired. And so if you're retaining outside security, and that's in conjunction with the assault and battery exclusion that's typically on the policy, unless you do add the endorsement buying that coverage back. But what I typically recommend is that if you're hiring a security company outside, third-party company, obviously very important to have an indemnity agreement with that company, and also secure additional insured coverage for your entity under their policy. And so that way, if it's excluded under your policy, if any harm arises out of security personnel that are working on your behalf, and your consumption lounge or dispensary or entity is sued as a result of that conduct, you can claim coverage under their insurance. You don't have to make a claim under your own policy. So keep that in mind. Additional insured coverage protections are always really important. And I think carriers obviously like it when you have that as well, because that insulates them a bit for claims on their own policy.
And to jump in real quick on what Matt had mentioned about seeing some assault and battery claims happen at dispensaries, add the wrinkle that we're talking about consumption lounges. So, and we're going to speak in a second about the first consumption lounge in Nevada, in Las Vegas specifically. And it's not only utilizing or opportunity to utilize flower, but it's also for THC infused beverages. And what we don't know is the mindset of the general public as they enter the consumption lounge. Like, were they enjoying a beverage or some flower prior to arrival? So that's that whole slip and fall, as well as assault and battery concern under general liability coverage, because now you're going to have an active participation of consumption on premise. And where does the business need to step in and make sure that people make sure they're not unruly? So there's where security is important, where the concern about is the public safe at your facility. And that's going to be a big thing for us, I'm sure, looking forward.
Right, and that goes hand in hand with what we were talking about earlier, which is education, ensuring that the patrons understand what it means to consume a certain product and how different products might affect you in different ways, right? Edibles will have a later onset compared to smoking flower otherwise. And so, yeah, it really starts at that, outset of risk mitigation and training.
Yep, great point. The product liability is another area. I mean, with cannabis coming online and becoming more acceptable in many parts of our country and in parts of our population, there are some people who are trying it maybe for the first time, and they're just getting going on it. And if they suffer some sort of a medical incident or injury because of use of the product, that's where the product liability comes into play. And with our metric system, from seed to sale, you're going to be able to be tracked on where the product was, where it wound up. If it caused some injury to some person, then you want to make sure the responsible parties are all being noted as additional insureds, as Jody kind of mentioned a little bit ago. If you bought a product from the retailer, which as it stands now, that's what will have to happen to be able to have the product in it. You have to buy it from a retailer there in the consumption lounge. So that retailer, you want to make sure has product liability coverage, so you can transfer that to the responsible party, and then the retailer will then want to make sure they transfer that to whoever made the product. So there's a chain of reactions there with the additional insured piece. But being able to do that and then show your underwriters or show your brokers that you are doing that as an internal control will help you obtain insurance and get the best price for it too. So I don't want to gloss over the product liability piece, because I think that's critical. And unfortunately, I do see operators not carry that line of coverage, and I think it's critically important.
Yeah, and I am going to get on my soapbox here, because this is one of, I think, the most important and overlooked and misunderstood insurance coverages. Licensees, right? You often have, insurance requirements to get your license, and then sometimes there are steps that are overlooked, including product liability insurance in jurisdictions where it's not required. Sometimes there's a misconception that the product liability is on your GL policy, and sometimes it is. Unfortunately, for the cannabis industry in particular, most times it is not, so it has to be purchased separately. And it's also important to understand, and Matt mentioned this, but everyone in the supply chain can be sued if someone is harmed with a product. So if you are the last step, if you're the retailer or you're the lounge and you're selling the product, you can be liable if someone is hurt with the product. And it seems speculative in some respects to think, well, who's going to really sue for this? We've seen the lawsuits, especially with what I call the VapeGate endeavor, right? Back before the pandemic happened, the vaping epidemic was a big thing. And there were a lot of, a handful of many lawsuits against tobacco manufacturers, but a handful of them have been brought against cannabis operators. And that includes, the vape manufacturer, the battery manufacturer, and the retail stores. And oftentimes the retailers are the ones that get hit the hardest and pursued the hardest, because sometimes the battery, if it's an exploding battery claim, something like that, the battery is manufactured in China, and those people can't be sued in the US. So even if you have a very good defense to that claim, if you're sued, you're also incurring a lot of defense costs, and it takes a very long time to get through litigation. So just be very mindful of that, evaluating your policy, checking for product liability coverage and defense cost coverage that goes hand in hand with that product liability policy.
Yeah.
We do have a question that we're going to postpone until the next slide because we are prepped for your question, Mr. Shank, and look forward to answering that question live in our next slide. But go ahead, Matt.
Okay, so other products, I mean, the other interesting one on here on product liability, just to kind of finalize this, is the bud tender's professional liability. There are some programs that will offer that. So in the event that a bud tender gives advice, or one of your employees gives advice on, what to use, what not to use, and it causes some sort of bodily injury to that patron, then there is a sublimit sometimes that some programs will give you for coverage there. So another thing to kind of look at that you typically have to add on after you purchase a program. So just want to make sure you close some of those gaps.
That's an excellent point. And I just remembered, sorry, something that I wanted to mention just while we're on the topic of GL and product liability before we move on. And that's exclusion. So again, depending on what carrier, I haven't seen Cannasure's policy, there might be others that are coming into the market. Regardless of what policy it is, be sure you're looking at the exclusions and endorsements that might limit coverage to certain types of products. So we often see policies that have exclusions for edibles or for vape devices or for vape devices that use certain types of products. And some policies have what they call a health hazard exclusion that might limit recovery for bodily injury arising out of the use of the product, for health problems arising out of the use of a product. So just bear that in mind. It's important to read the policy as a whole to make sure you're understanding what coverage is afforded.
Yeah, good point. The exclusions, that there's not a common product on here from the insurance side. So working with the experience and folks that have read these policy forms is going to really help you because they're not all the same. And you really have to watch out for the gaps or the potential gotchas. I've brought on new accounts, new clients, simply for the reason that they had claims that weren't covered and didn't realize they had exclusions in there. So it is critical to look for that stuff. Crime is another one that gets sometimes overlooked because it's not included. And when you get a property and general liability policy, most of the time, it's many times this is another separate policy. Or with Cannasure's product, you can get up to a $25,000 limit. But that if an employee steals from you, or there's high cash in the cannabis industry, if the theft of cash is taken from you, it doesn't get covered on your general liability and product liability in those programs. It's more times than not a separate policy after a certain amount. And so Cannasure has up to 25,000, but beyond that, there's nothing there, and you have to buy that coverage from Cannasure. It's not automatically included. So another critical one to look at. Property is another one. I did see some questions in there about hey, what if stuff gets damaged inside our facility? And I don't really know what these cannabis consumption lounges will look like. I've heard people in the industry talk about the experience and maybe even modeling it after the bottle service, or we've got this big nightclub experience thing going on here in Las Vegas right now. So having being able to use the product from the best and most expensive products out there, whether it's a vape or a bong or whatever it might be, it could get damaged. So you've got property in there. So make sure you've got some coverage for your contents, your product. And I like to look at that as if you were to turn your building upside down and shake it, it's all the stuff that falls out. So what's your coverage for that? Also on here, and I'll let Jody maybe offer something on here too. Part of the property form, it's not listed here, would be business income and extra expense or business interruption. Another critical one to look at in a consumption lounge, if you've had a property loss, fire burns it down, someone runs their car into it, and you can't open the doors, well, you're going to lose a heck of a lot of revenue. And did you have business interruption or business income coverage? And the only way to get it is through that property form. Jody, I don't know if you want to add something to that. That's a big one.
No, just to be mindful that that's an important coverage, because any sort of property damage that results, if you need to close your doors, and we saw it with the pandemic, unfortunately, there are many, many companies out there still fighting their insurance companies to try to get coverage for business interruption arising from the pandemic and the virus. That's a very tricky legal question. But in a typical case, if your property is damaged by a fire and you have business interruption coverage, that coverage will kick in if you have to shut down for a certain time to rebuild. So that's a very important one. And, I think depending upon, we'll see how this rolls out with consumption lounges, there might be things like, will there be open flame, or people using lighting implements? Is that something that we should be concerned about, certainly for property coverage and risk management? But yeah, property coverage is one of the most important, sort of threshold insurance products that you're going to want as part of a package for a consumption lounge.
Yep. And this coverage is available. The last one we've got noted down here is employment practices liability. Some of you may have heard EPL or EPLI, and this is another one that too often gets overlooked in the industry. And these are, the lawsuits that come to an operator or an establishment about, discrimination. I was fired for this reason wrongfully, and now I'm going to sue you. I was harassed, I was sexually harassed, or any other type of wrongful act. And there's a note on here for first and third party. A critical piece to look at is, I see sometimes where an establishment will buy first party only employment practices liability. And that's great if your own employees are suing, the owners and management. What it doesn't cover is the third party. So in this respect, there'll be customers there. What happens if one of your employees starts making inappropriate comments or maybe hits on one of the customers, and that customer wants to sue the establishment because they didn't train their employees properly, or a vendor for that matter that comes in? Those are third parties. So make sure when you buy your employment practices liability, you have not only first party, but also third party coverage.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly important in this context. We see that sort of liability, harassment, things of that nature in a third party context, in the liquor liability world, right? It's very similar here, where you're dealing with potentially intoxicated customers feeling maybe ultra sensitive or experiencing totally new things, right? And interacting with employees of the company. So you want to make sure that that's something that's part of your package too. So probably everyone has heard of dram shop liability. It's a concept that's been around for a very long time. Gram shop liability is what we're calling the concept as applied to cannabis. And so gram being the smallest size that you can buy, arguably. And so that's why we're calling it gram shop. So good thing for those operating in Nevada, it's one of the few states that don't impose liability, so civil liability on an establishment which serves or arguably overserves the customer that goes on to cause harm, right? So we see this all the time. An intoxicated person gets in the car and they, drive and have an accident and maybe someone gets hurt or killed. It's all too common, unfortunately. And so many states hold taverns, bars, et cetera, restaurants liable if they serve a already intoxicated person, or sometimes, depending on the law, they serve an underage person and that person goes on to hurt someone, or if they have, if there's some visible showing of intoxication when the person arrives on the establishment, there's a liability or potential for liability there. Nevada is going to be introducing, or it's already introducing AB 341, which is intended to extend insulation, so protections for companies to avoid that sort of liability. So under Nevada law, we will see a very similar rulemaking that will protect establishments for over-serving. I think, as Matt mentioned at the beginning, the rulemaking process is still ongoing. And so we haven't seen the rules yet, but there is a assumption that similar to civil liability associated with serving underage people with alcohol establishments, there would be penalties. So not necessarily civil liability, but there would be administrative penalties for establishments that serve underage folks at consumption lounges in the same way. So we're going to have to just wait and see what those regs look like, but very, very likely that it's going to mirror the existing regulations in place for alcohol establishments.
And Jody did a great job there. And you answered effectively 2/3 of Bryce's question. So let's just finish that off real quick.
Okay.
So would the GL policy have coverage for someone who left an establishment under the influence and then caused injury? We believe there's going to be some defense coverage in the policy to defend the business from that potential claim against them from someone being overserved in their establishment. But as Jody just mentioned, there's protections for the business in that case. So the reality of the claim getting paid by the insurance industry or even the business is going to be negligible or maybe even non-existent because of the current law in Nevada that recognizes effectively no dram shop liability. And the cases that we shared that have already established that law, the precedent here in Nevada.
Yeah,
And
that's
then,
excellent. Yeah, I'm glad we were able to tie that question in. I didn't have it up in my view.
yeah, it's live. I mean, you spoke to most of it, but then to finish the last part of it is the expectation, like today in the bars, taverns world, there is the ability to buy a separate liquor liability policy. Going forward, we know that there's at least one insurance company that I've done some research on that will have a separate or monoline cannabis liability policy. So there would be an additional buffer of coverage if the business wanted to pay for it. Not sure how necessary that coverage is going to be in the state of Nevada for the reality how the dram shop law is protecting the business instead of the consumer, but it's going to be there. The industry is going to respond to that. So effectively, the answer is yes, Bryce, there's going to be coverage in some form or fashion for the business in the case of someone being overserved and leaving the establishment and causing injury.
Yeah, and I think just to emphasize again, Jim, good point on the defense coverage, right? People get sued all the time for cases that end up dismissed because they can't, create a cause of action, or there's some affirmative defense that otherwise should, kick in to protect the defendant. But here, right, companies, consumption lounges could get sued, notwithstanding this, the protections that are intended to be in place. And so working the case through the process of getting the case dismissed often can take a long time in and of itself. And so that can be costly and important to have the coverage for defense.
That would be the number one reason, in my opinion, to get it. And to compare this with the liquor liability, the host liquor liability programs you get in Nevada now. I also work with bars and taverns in our state. And yes, while there is no dram shop law, many of my clients do still buy the coverage, and they buy it for the defense. And to Jim's point, is there a need? There's not a big exposure, I guess, there on damages being paid, but the defense is. But the good news is, in Nevada at least, liquor liability rates are much lower than other states that do have dram shop laws. So it's not a big premium increase to get it in Nevada, at least. And I would expect that cannabis may follow suit.
Yeah, and I think just to close that out at the end here, just thinking about litigation and the way that lawsuits proceed, and the importance of product liability coverage in the first instance. Even like I said, if like we were talking about, if the dram shop or gram shop protections are there, plaintiffs' lawyers are often very creative in the way that they frame causes of action. And so we would expect you might see claims for things that try to plead around this liability protection, right? So it could be claims based on, misrepresentation or fraud about the type of product, or, advice given by a bud tender. You didn't tell me it was going to do X, right? And so that's the liability, and not necessarily the consumption or overconsumption. It's unclear sort of at this stage, right, how the affirmative defense might work in a case like that. So not to give anyone any ideas, but I think the important point is, right, it's good to have the protections just in case of worst case scenario. slide and turn it over to Jim to talk a little bit more about the coverage.
And we're in the home stretch, everyone. So probably just another couple of minutes to conclude. And this last slide is effectively marketplace research to share with you what the insurance industry is ready to do for Nevada with your new law. And I spent a bit of time talking to all of my peers that are in the cannabis insurance industry, because there are a few carriers out there. You know, as much as I represent Cannasure and am proud of the work that we do have competition, as does everybody out there. And in doing so, we have a very, very friendly cannabis insurance industry, of which I can call many of the folks that I compete against as friends. And in doing that work, found out what the rest of the industry is doing besides us. So starting with Cannasure, of course, we already write the first consumption lounge in Las Vegas, and that is the Las Vegas Paiutes that are just about a mile away from the Fremont Experience, and they've opened up a beautiful cannabis marketplace under their brand New Woo, which means of people. And it is a gorgeous facility that we would ask anyone to go visit just to get a starting point of what does a consumption lounge look like as a potential benchmark in Las Vegas or in the state of Nevada. And then moving on, there are a number of national carriers, insurance companies, carriers, that some are focused on large businesses where they're doing multi-state operations, MSO, or they're large in the cannabis space. And some of those companies are saying that we're ready for the new law. We've done the research. We want to write cannabis consumption lounges in Nevada. We write some in other states already. I know New York State is one similar to Nevada where it's on tribal land. And there's been another one of our competitors that have picked up that coverage. There's a couple of other insurance carriers that have stated that they're kicking the tires on the new law and probably will enter the marketplace on a either case-by-case basis or haven't quite concluded their legal research to find out exactly how they want to enter the marketplace with a certain coverage form. Do they go into cannabis consumption lounge and say, okay, well, we're going to only insure folks who sell flower and not the THC infused beverages? So there's some work that some other carriers are still going through to find out what are they going to do in terms of offering coverage, if at all. We had a coverage, a carrier that bullet point number 5 that said, we're not willing to extend coverage to cannabis consumption lounges at this time. While they write plenty of dispensaries, they're not quite ready to say yes to consumption lounges. And that's okay. That's their appetite. And if they choose to backtrack on that decision, we'll see where they land. But at the end of the day, we know the insurance industry is ready to respond to AB 341. And as I teased up earlier, there's an insurance carrier that has already said, and this is the last point, that we're going to offer a standalone policy for a consumption lounge. So if carrier X says we'll handle the dispensary, but we won't extend policy to the consumption lounge, there's another carrier that's saying we'll write a little rider, a little policy just for the cannabis liability component of the risk for the consumption lounge. So the answers are out there. The industry is ready to respond. And as you and our audience are going through the pretty expensive process of applying for a license, you'll find that your business will be protected by the insurance industry, and specifically Cannasure, since we know we already have, that first consumption lounge in place in Las Vegas. To the question that was posed, I just answered the first part of it. And then we do expect special events to happen where there's consumption, where it may not be at the dispensary. We currently insure some of those events today with some of our partners in the cannabis insurance world. And there's some crazy events that are happening with axe throwing, with puppy adoption, with carnival rides, with live music, alcohol, as well as cannabis consumption. So there's a host, a number of special events that are out there, and there are carriers that will provide full coverage for those events. Question is how pricey is that? We'll find out as we go through the process of unleashing what the different activities are and understanding them fully. But the answers are out there, the coverage is available. It just reflects that pretty much we're ready to go. So with that, there's no reason to be concerned that the coverage is not going to be there for those who are looking to apply for that cannabis consumption lounge license. And we stand ready to assist. The three of us here have been in the industry for quite some time on the cannabis side. You'll see that we've shared our contact information on the next slide, and here to answer your questions to be supportive of your efforts in the industry. You got to read Lloyd's question.
Thanks, Jim. I think it's a point more so than a question, and it's a good point. Prior to member consumption, our club hopes to have members review a written statement regarding impairment times for edibles versus smoking and vaping, which is excellent. It's a good start, right? And that addresses one of the big concerns I think that insurers and people overall have over, how do we really understand how impaired people are and make sure that they understand how impaired they might be with a product when you can't quite measure impairment in the same way that you do for alcohol. And I think that is really one of the big pressure points for insurers getting into, insuring consumption lounges is how do you judge impairment and how do we take, adequate precautions to ensure that people are not getting, too high and then leaving and getting in a car or otherwise hurting themselves or others.
And Jody, would you recommend a cannabis consumption lounge having kind of a waiver? When people attend an event, they sign a waiver. If they're going to axe throwing, they sign a waiver that they're not holding the venue responsible for their own actions. Would you think that there is a suggestion on a waiver? And sorry, Christopher.
You read somebody's mind. Yeah, you're on the same wavelength as Christopher Laporte over here. Yeah, it's a good, absolutely. Anything that a company can do to try to protect and insulate itself from liability is a really important point. And so, yeah, you could do something like that. I think it makes sense. You're doing age verification when people are entering. It would be as simple as having an iPad or some other, electronic signature, read the fine print, sign your name. There's always questions of whether those sorts of waivers and limitations of liability are enforceable by courts, if they're boilerplate terms or things that people aren't really reading. But at the end of the day, right, as an attorney, I think we would recommend at least having the precautions in place, and having all of those risk transfer mechanisms that you can at least try to protect yourself from liability on the front end. But it really starts with risk management and compliance and SOPs and training, to begin with. So hopefully with all of those things in place, we're not going to see a lot of claims.
Well put. And that was great. And Jim, great comment. And all the insurance options are there, whether you're a standalone consumption lounge, whether you're in conjunction with the dispensary. There are products out there that are coming online to help.
Thank you, everyone. That should wrap up the presentation today. And I appreciate you, Jody, Matt, and Jim, for sharing your expertise. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. So if you have any additional questions or would like to take advantage of their vast stores of knowledge on this topic, please do reach out to them. So thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon, morning.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you to the Nevada Cannabis Association.